Good morning, everyone. It's now 10 o'clock, so I shall resume this inquiry regarding the Marks and Spencer store near Marble Arch. This is day 5 of the inquiry. Usual reminders to silence electronic devices. Are there any members of the public here today who wish to make a statement? Fine. Turning to the timetable.
The bar chart is very straightforward.
Oh, right.
It's a tax year, so it runs from March to April.
Okay.
So Christmas is in it.
Right.
But I've asked for details of that to be put in the note so that you can cross-check and satisfy yourself on that.
Lovely. That's very helpful. Thank you. And the promised statement of common ground.
So we received the draft on Monday evening. We reviewed it yesterday. Obviously, I was busy with other things yesterday. But as soon as we finished, myself and the witness sat down and had a conversation about it, and we sent a track change version of the draft at 9 o'clock this morning. So it's with M&S, and with any luck, I would have thought we could get agreement on the document today.
I'm grateful I haven't seen that, but I've been doing that stuff as well. I think that sounds promising.
Good, good. Any other procedural, administrative, or housekeeping matters? Then, Mr. Fraser, please introduce yourself.
Thank you, sir. You may have gathered that Mr. Sturgis is intending to do a presentation on his evidence in chief. And
Mr. Harris, have you seen the presentation?
I haven't. It's been sent, but I've been stuck.
No,
Cross-examination here. I've explained to my learned friend that I'm not going to stand in the way of him presenting it. You said, sir, that obviously if there was anything new in that, then we'd have to consider recalling Mr. Pilbrow. I'm hoping we don't need to do that, but I will need to reserve the.
Me too, but I quite understand.
Yes, but what I'm going to suggest, sir, is perhaps we could produce something in writing, if necessary, as a first course.
That always comes.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
do you want me to move my desk?
It might be useful if that's all right. I'm going to the nice gentleman in that from yesterday.
Thank you. That's what I did.
Okay.
So there are two gentlemen to my right. The older gentleman is Mr. Simon Sturgis, and he is. I'm going to take, if I may, sir, as read both his proof of evidence and his rebuttal. And the presentation will draw on some of the key points. And as my learned friend has alluded to, the vast majority of what you're about to hear is in his evidence already.
Yeah.
But inevitably, because of Mr. Pilbrow's new material presented in his evidence in chief, we've had to respond to that. So there is a bit of new material. Mr. Sturgis, I'm just going to introduce you to the inquiry. If we take up paragraph 1.1 of your proof of evidence, it says that you are Mr. Sturgis of Targeting Zero LLP, and you are acting on behalf of Save Britain's Heritage, and you hold a diploma from the Architectural Association School of Architecture. You are a registered architect and a member of the of RIBA. You founded Targeting Zero LLP in 2018, and that's succeeded Sturgis Carbon Profiling LLP, founded in 2010, and you specialise in embodied and whole life carbon assessment in the built environment. You then go on to say that you've had 14 years in the field of embodied and whole life carbon assessment, plus as an architect and managing director of Sturgis Associates, LLP, from 1991 till 2014. Your credentials are listed in paragraph 1.3. I'm not going to read them all out, but just to note a couple of them. You are the co-author of the London Plan Guidance on whole life cycle carbon assessments for policy SI2 from March 2022 of this year, and you were also the final point in that paragraph, the special advisor to the Environmental Audit Select Committee inquiry on whole life carbon 2021 to 2022, which resulted in the report Building to Net Zero Costing Carbon in Construction, which a reference is made in SAVE's opening statement. At paragraph 1.4, you then go on to set out your experience specifically of refurbishment and retrofit throughout the period of 1991 until 2017. And I understand that some of these examples you're going to refer to in your PowerPoint presentation. So without further ado, I'll hand over to you now to take the floor.
Thank you. Good morning, sir. Good morning. Right, the next slide. So what I wanted to do today is really talk you through the whole issue of refurbishment, because I think that, as I've said in first my initial report and in subsequent commentary, that this has not been properly addressed by Marks and Spencer. So to start with, we've got obviously the 3 buildings on the site as they are today, and 2 of those are less than 50 years old, and there is no suggestion they are in poor condition past a certain point, but also they are valuable carbon assets, which in my view should be maintained and retained. Next, please. So what I thought I would do is just, first of all, look at the client and say, well, what do they think about this? So if I've got 3 particular quotes here, which I want to take from Marks and Spencer's Plan A. So the first of those is, Plan A represents our planet-based goals with our main mission to become a net zero business across scopes 1, 2, and 3 by 2040. Now, for clarification, scopes 1 and 2 really to do with energy use, and scope 3 is to do with materials and supply chain and so on. Second quote, again, Plan A, this is under governance. Sustainability is core to the M&S brand, and our ESG framework brings together the individual business strategies into a shared program to engage our customers and enable us to report on performance at group level. Now, there's the word brand, which you heard a bit about yesterday. And I would suggest that one of the problems here is for Marks and Spencer is that the brand that they've built up around Plan A is now suffering already because of this inquiry and the lead up to it, damage. And I think that if they had the opportunity to actually rethink this and go for a much more a retrofit refurbishment type option, that would be potentially a leading way to demonstrate to the industry and retail and so on, and particularly office, how you can actually produce something for the future. Then the third quote here, this again, Plan A, waste and circular economy. Over 200 million tonnes of waste is discarded in the UK each year, according to the latest government figures. Of this, half is generated by construction activities. So M&S are entirely aware that waste and construction activities is a big issue, but they have chosen to ignore that particular thing. Next. And then this final quote from Marks and Spencer, Plan A. So what they say here is that every human activity has a carbon footprint. We all need to cut emissions to avoid the worst consequences of climate change. No company can hope to prosper in a world where we continue to plunder resources and pump CO2 into the atmosphere at the rate we are today. And there are practical considerations for our business: energy costs, the availability of raw materials, new markets, and I've underlined here new legislation. So if we look at new legislation, next. So these are 3 key bits of legislation that have come out since 2019. And I think it's probably the reason why the Secretary of State's called this in. So the top one there, first one is the government committed us by a change to the 2008 Climate Change Act. In 2019, at the end of Theresa May's prime ministership, that we would be committed to 100% reductions by 2050. So that is what the UK economy has been committed to by the government legislation. Then in 2021, the Johnson administration committed us to, again, through an amendment to the Climate Change Act, 78% reductions by 2035. And also in 2021, but also as a nationally determined contribution in 2020, the UK was committed to 68% reductions by 2030. And 2030, of course, is only 8 years away. So that is quite demanding. All of those are demanding. And what that means is a trajectory down from 1990, when this was zero, if you like, zero reductions, down to 100% reductions in 2050. So this sort of level of demand suggests that all aspects of the economy need to respond and need to do things in a different way. And what is interesting about this, in my view, is that Mr. Pilbrow said that the decision to go with a new build option was made in 2018. In other words, just before these 3 bits of legislation. Now, what I find interesting about this is that Marks and Spencer, who claim significant sustainability credentials, plus Arups, likewise claiming significant sustainability credentials, and Mr. Pilbrow's practice, who also claim sustainability credentials, none of them thought to reflect after the 2018 decision to go with a new build, to reflect on that in the light of these 3 bits of legislation. And after all, the net zero by 2050 was only a year after they'd made that decision. So it seems as if none of this paid any bearing or had any interest to the Marks and Spencer and their team, all of whom, as I say, are claiming above average sustainability credentials. Next, please. So what I wanted to do is I'm going to take you through the first one. I just want to make a couple of comments about Mr. Pilbrow's scheme. So this is a part of an elevation from Oxford. This is part of the Oxford Street elevation. I recognise it. And Mr. Pilbrow, and it's been repeated quite a lot in various other documents, has made a claim that the building is a 120-year design. Next slide, please. Now, if you look at, and on the left here, this is out of the Arups Whole Life Carbon Assessment Planning Submission document. What this is showing is that there's nothing, this is a list of all the bits and pieces in the building. So you've got structure, services, cladding, and so on. Nothing in that list is more than 35 years life expectancy. Now, what Mr. Pilbrow said is that the issue for him on that is because the RICS professional statement, which is on the right here, sets out those timeframes, and therefore he's going with them. Now, and that is correct. So next slide, please. But if you look at the RICS professional statement, and Mr. Pilbrow will know this, obviously, because he's been involved with that. It says here the lifespans provided in Table 9 should be used for the components listed in the absence of more specific data. These figures, in other words, the ones in this table, should be replaced with the actual life expectancies of the specific items to be used in the project as information becomes available. So in other words, you're not bound by this. If it was thought necessary to challenge the timeframes put by Arups, the Pilbrow team could have done so, but they chose not to. So I can only assume they must have agreed with them. Next slide, please. Now, this slide here is an illustration of those things that need to be replaced in red within 35 years, according to the Arups. assumptions. And in green, I've put, and Mr. Pilbright, I'm sure he put it in writing to you, but are the things that would take have a really good life. So what you look at here is a brick and stone system which forms the base of the cladding, but everything else, all the windows, aluminium cladding, would, according to the Arabs thing, the Arabs list, be replaced, but also would be replaced would be things like services, interior fit out, lifts, and basically everything inside the building. So what you're going to be left with after 35 odd years is, at the point, according to the Arabs list, is the solid bits of cladding here, if you like, and the structure. Things like roof membranes would also presumably have to be looked at, and central plant. Next slide, please. So what that means in terms of durability, there's not a great deal of difference between this building and this building, being Neil House, because this building is now 42 years old. And yes, it needs the same sort of level of replacement. It needs plant replacing, it needs certainly the windows probably need to be replaced. This cladding, I'm not quite sure what it's made of, but if it's made of something like bronze, which is possible, then you could replace it. But if you could keep it, I would guess. But certainly the probability is you replace all of that, which is exactly the same thing happened to this. So what I'm saying is there's an equivalence, and say 42 years, which is the age of this building, after this has been completed, you'd be in exactly the same position. So they're very similar propositions. Next slide, please. Now, a lot has been made of this particular diagram, which I want to take you through, which is the options. And as I said, the decision, I'm quoting Mr. Pilbrow, the decision to demolish was taken in 2018. So if we look at these, and what I've got here for you on the left is the facade retention section, which I'll come back to in a minute. But what you're looking at here is the 16 options that Mr. Pilbrow's referred to. So the first row of these, all of these represent new build options. So those are not really what I'm talking about. Then you look at this row here, and again, all of these includes the significant new build elements to them. And indeed, if you look at this sort of one here, there's no additional flooring on either floors. There are no additional extra floors on either of these two buildings, which I will come back to. If you go on to this line here, again, these are all new construction. Now, it's been suggested that these two here in particular, or possibly even that one, represent the full refurbishment option that I've been describing. Now, what I mean by a full refurbishment is, if you like, optimizing the existing buildings. That's it. I'm not putting forward something that is peculiar or a very particular kind of design solution. What I'm putting forward, and I will go through after these slides, is the logic that builds up to why these buildings can be refurbished in a straightforward and logical fashion. So if we just look at these bottom two here, full site facade retention. Now, the facade retention is this section here. And what this is showing is facade retained, but an entirely new structure put behind it. And you'll see here that the windows in the old, in the new, don't line through with the windows in the old. And as Mr. Pilbrow and I think we both agree that that is not a good idea. That's a bad solution. Which brings us on to the 16th one at the bottom here. But again, this one has a significant new build element over here. And it shows two floors, new floors on top of Orchard House, but it shows nothing extra on this one. So again, that is not what I'm describing as optimizing the opportunities of the existing buildings. So in this group of 16, neither the light touch refurbishment, which has been consistently referred to, is not one of these options shown here, nor is what I'm describing, which I'll come to now, which is the substantial refurbishment. In other words, making the most of the existing buildings. Next slide. So now, these two plans come from the planning application. That one you'll probably recognise. That's the ground. That's a typical floor plan, existing first floor plan. And this is a diagram showing, is from Arab's structural survey report. Now, what is interesting about this is that what you're looking at, as has been mentioned before, is 1, 2, 3, and a fourth set of structures. So this structure here, if you look at it, you're looking at a pretty straightforward grid. And you've got various little things like this where lifts are, or like this where there's a staircase or something. And here we've got either escalators or whatever it is, more lifts. But fundamentally, underneath all this is a pretty straightforward grid. The same applies to Orchard House. There's a pretty straightforward grid running around underneath that. And Neil House, likewise. There's a whole sort of business going on here with holes and lifts and so on. So I really don't understand what's going on there exactly, but I'm sure with further work that could be figured out. Next slide, please. So what I've done here is I've had a go of looking carefully at the drawings, this drawing and the structural grid, and putting on the columns. Now, what you'll see, and this may not be perfect, and I'm sure you'll be advised if I've got it wrong.
I'm sure you will be.
I'm sure I will be too. But the basic,
Sorry to cut across. Is this one of the new documents then?
this black line
not seen
thing
that.
is a new diagram.
Your attempt.
Yeah. But it, as I say, it follows what's going on here. So what I'm showing here is that actually the grids in all three of these are relatively straightforward. They're not necessarily very peculiar or strange. The other key point is that a number of things here do not appear on here, which could have two reasons. Either I've got it wrong, or they are vertical surfaces, in which case they would come out in any substantial refurbishment. The other thing I want to point out is that a lot of columns here have got bigger than the basic structure. And that is because I imagine that either they've been boxed out with services inside or for display, because I've noticed on the ground floor in M&S that they seem to like having displays on quite big columns. Next slide, please. The other thing I think is important to note is that, and this comes from the Arab thing, is they've got, without going into sort of detail, but they've got loadings that these floors are capable of. And in essence, these floors are capable of reuse, in a nutshell. So they've got spare capacity to enable these buildings to be used as offices today. Next slide, please. To talk about the facade, so nothing in any of the reports as part of the submission have suggested that there's anything fundamentally bad about any of these facades, apart from the fact that they are ugly, maybe, but they're not falling apart. The brickwork is, as I say, 42 years old, but is not falling off. Nobody suggests it's falling off. Clearly, there's work that needs to be done in terms of things like air tightness, insulation improvement, dealing with cold bridging, which Mr. Pilbrow mentioned, and various other things, all of which are fairly normal refurbishment issues. So all of the things that are problematic with these facades can be dealt with and repaired. And I believe they can be brought up to a standard that in environmental efficiency terms is pretty close to what you get from a new build. Next slide, please. Now, the other thing that's been mentioned repeatedly is that the ceilings in this building are too low, or ceilings generally are too low. Now, I wouldn't disagree. When you walk through that night, when we walked through the site, there was quite a lot of low ceilings around. Now, what's interesting is that, first of all, when you look at this drawing from the Pilbrow group of evidence, that the structure that is shown here, there's frequently a very big gap between underside of the structure shown and the ceiling level. Now, obviously, to some extent, it's maybe approximate, but fundamentally, there are gaps there. And what we do know is that the services will be old and inefficient in various different ways. Therefore, I think it's not unreasonable to suggest that all of these ceilings could be either pushed up, or as seems to be the, if you like, the trend today is to not have ceilings and to go up to the soffit with exposed services, whether that's office or retail. Now, in the basement on this drawing, they show the floor to ceiling is 2.41 meters. And I've been down there, I've done some measurements. And yes, there is one or two areas. There's a particularly low area, one back area, but most of it is not like that. Next slide, please. And what I would like just to refer you to do with offices is the BCO, British Council for Offices guidance. And they're saying here for refurbishment, this is a new document. So
it's got a date.
2019.
Right, so you mean it's a new document to the inquiry?
New document to the inquiry, yes, sir. So in this, it says in refurbishing offices, refurbishment, if I put it here in bigger writing, 2.45 to 2.8 meters. So the lowest is they're suggesting here is 2.45, but they are also saying lower clear heights are acceptable in some circumstances. So if you can remember that 2.45 meter height. Next slide, please. So if I look at these, each of these, and this information here is stuff I've worked out, so this is new to the inquiry, if you like. So what I'm saying here is to reach that 2.45 height, which would be acceptable for refurbishment for BCO, and bearing in mind that's still having a ceiling, we need to get 60 millimeters higher, so 2.390. We need to get 60 millimeters to meet that figure of 2.45, or the underside of the slab, and I'm estimating it, I'm assuming there's about 400 or 500 of actual slab on each one, but to get over 3 meters, so say 3.2, but certainly over 3 meters. On this floor, we need to get 90 millimeters. And on this floor, we need to get 110 millimeters. Now, I would reckon that all of those are possible, as I will show you in a minute. All of those are possible on this building, because by putting in new services, whether you go with ceilings or not with ceilings, and indeed Mr. Pilbrow's new scheme does not have ceilings, it has services up on the soffit. So I reckon you could certainly achieve all of those increases. This floor already exceeds the BCO basic minimum. Now, on these 3 floors, which are the retail floors, and I'll come on to, I've measured this one, but these 2 here, again, I'm working out based on an assumption, assumed 400 to 500 thickness of the slab, which is probably generous or conservative, if you like. So there's about 3.7 meters, I'm guessing, to the other side of the slab here, about 4.5 on the ground floor, and about 3.5 in the basement. So if we go to the next slide, please. So now these photographs were taken during our site visit when we were doing a walkabout. And on the 5th floor, there was a corner room. And I think you're one of these figures, which I've blanked out. But this is the corner room on Orchard House looking north. And you'll see here we've got a fairly low looking ceiling. What is interesting is if you go into the lift lobby where you get a full understanding of the height, you can see, I mean, you don't have to measure it, you can actually see that these are trick photographs, the same iPhone photographs. There is significantly more height available that is being used, and obviously that is because in here we've got air conditioning units and presumably ductwork and what have you. So what I'm saying is that there's a sort of walking around, you get a misleading impression because, as has been pointed out, there's all sorts of stuff in there which needs to come out. Next slide, please. So what I wanted to show you was an example, and this is new information. this is a scheme that I did as a refurbishment, 2009, and this building was originally an H-shaped plan, like this, and it was offices up to this level as an H-shaped plan. Then there's a residential block sitting on top of it, which you can just see the top of there. What we did was we filled in these two bits, hence all this cladding here, and all of this we reclad, but this had concrete upstands. Next slide, please. So when we finished it, this is what the interior looked like. So we had to deal with a height issue, and bearing in mind, I said to you that the office floors at Orchard House are over 3 meters to the soffit, and 2.45 would be the BCO minimum. This soffit here has 2.65 floor to soffit. Next slide, please. Oh, how's that going in? Right to the back.
Sorry.
Next one. That one. So as it happens, that previous slide, which was done in 2009, this building has just been refurbished. And this is the interior. Now what they've done here is, and if you compare this again, you've got 2.65 floor to soffit. They've exposed the columns, and you can see the columns are quite dense, or actually dense over there. But also what I draw your attention to is that this building has fairly limited amount of light. It has deep floor, quite deep floor space, and of course there's the low ceiling. And you can see here the air conditioning system has been put on, the cooling system has been put in here, which would no doubt distribute out depending on the layout. And then you've got light fittings hanging down in there. So with all this stuff here, you're down to a much lower height. Next slide, please. So you've got about 2.65, I said, and underneath things like beams and surfaces, you're about 2.2 to 2.3. So that's all quite low compared to Orchard House. Next slide, please. Now, what is interesting is that this space is on the market right now for £72.50 Cat A, which is without partitioning and so on, so it's fitted out with basic services and flooring and what have you. But if you want to fit it out, it's £79.50. So that's not a bad rent. And I'm thinking, well, the agent is Knight Frank. Now this building is in a worse location than being on Oxford Street. It's got lower floor to ceiling heights than Orchard House. And it is, the columns you can see here are quite dense. So in a way, I would suggest that this is a less attractive proposition in a number of ways compared to Orchard House. It is, but the agent Knight Frank, who is also the same agent that has been advising Marks and Spencer, that the buildings refurbished on the Marks and Spencer site are unviable, you know, and not capable of refurbishment and so on. Actually, you've got better space on the Marks and Spencer site than you have here. So I'm wondering why we couldn't achieve better rents here, bearing in mind that some of the space that I've explained to you would not just be refurbished, but we push a few extra floors on, which Arab's document said is possible. So next slide, please. So we go to the retail. Now, in the retail, in the basement, I measured this up to here as 3.5 meters. And of course, there are all sorts of things hanging down. Now, there is, over most of the basement level store, there is stuff like this. And there's, again, coming back to that column grid that I explained to you at the beginning, there are some really deep columns, beams on it. So there's a few beams here that you can see them there, you can see them there. Those deep beams are about 2.5 meters to the underside. Now, there is an area, there's one area at the back of the space, which is about 2.41 meters. Now, what's interesting is that this height here is the same as this building here. This is Marks and Spencer in Clapham, and these are the photographs from the Pilbara proof of evidence. And this was described by Mr. Pilbara as being really successful, quote unquote. So what I don't understand is why that can be really successful, and this is just a non-starting proposition. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry, before you do that, it's also worth noting that the underside of the various services and bits and bobs, structure, lighting and so on, is around 2.7 to 2.9 meters. Next slide, please. Now, if we look at the ground floor, and I haven't measured this, but I'm working from the Pilbara section. From the floor to the underside, this may be just below the underside of the slab, but this dimension, I reckon, subject to any correction, which I'm sure, as you said, will be coming, is about 4.5 meters, thereabouts. And looking at that, that doesn't seem to me like a hugely problematic situation. And bear in mind that if you cleared all this stuff out, all the existing surfaces and finishes, you could do something not unlike this, which I'm not saying is good or bad or different. It is the Nike store on Oxford Circus. And this store.
Hang on a second, I'm going to get.
Yes, that'd be a good idea on all levels.
So that's Oxford Circus.
Oh, yes, it's on the north
I'll find it.
east. Yeah, different degrees. But why I've illustrated this is it is also a Edwardian building with similar dimensions. I haven't measured this. I don't know whether it's the same or better or worse or whatever. But what I do know is that they have put in a whole lot of stuff here. They've painted it all black. And this is just as you come in through the entrance. But what is also interesting is that they've got columns quite frequently. They've got a column here, a column there, column there, column. So there's quite a lot of columns, column back there. But they don't seem to be bothered by the particular height. What they've gone for is a particular kind of, creative atmospheric interior fit out. So again, I can't see why there's such a huge problem with the ground floor of Marks and Spencer Oxford Street, given that if you did a fit out of this kind, either for Marks and Spencer or for somebody else, why it wouldn't work in a refurbishment? Next slide, please. Now, to talk about the plans, so the issues on this plan, as has been pointed out, are that, of course, we've got really blank frontage all the way along here. And that's because we've got all this storage and staircases and lifts and what have you. So the whole section of that facade is blanked out, which is obviously not great from a retailing point of view. There's also the loading bay here, which you're probably familiar with, and we've got a relatively pinched bit of retail here. And of course, that's now currently used by somebody else. Next slide, please. Now, what I've done here is I've overlaid, which is part of my rebuttal evidence, the diagram of how I would perceive this could be reimagined. So the loading bay, and I'll come to the loading bay in more detail in a minute. The loading bay would go in exactly the same place, and be the same size as the loading bay on the proposed scheme. So you have all those problems around loading and unloading and doing it forward and all that sort of thing would be resolved in exactly the same way. Then you've got the office entrance, which I'm suggesting goes in here. And the core, I don't see why we couldn't follow basically the same sort of pattern here, which will have benefits in terms of escape and so on, and of course access and so on the ground floor. Now, what I'm also showing here is that clearly, and it's been pointed out, is that there are issues about the presentation of the office building. And obviously this has a recessed facade and so on, and a front door there. But there's no reason why this facade in this section here, the facade in this area, and this is the joint between Orchard House and the Orchard Street extension, why that section of the facade couldn't be remodeled in quite a significant way, or addition added onto it, or with canopies, or combination. Why you couldn't make that much more interesting, exciting, and a front door to the office space. Now, in terms of retail, and the same thing would apply here. So what I'm saying is that you could achieve something similar to this retail arcade that they've got here on the Pilbara scheme. Obviously, it's not going to be quite as dramatic a front door, but you could remodel this bit of facade as well. Now, the other thing I'd point out is that on the Pilbara scheme, you do, of course, have this going through, this arcade going through here. But a large proportion of this is got lifts in it, or this blank bit here. In addition, you've got office space, Class E, it says all around here, and more office space around here. So you've only got a really small bit of display here and here with entrances and exits there and there. So compare that with, and of course you've got this courtyard. So yes, you have got that way through, but I'm suggesting that you could have, instead of office space all around here, you could have retail. So this retail in yellow here is, I believe, what you could achieve in a refurbishment. And you will note that there's considerably more yellow on this drawing than there is on this drawing. So, and indeed, on the Pilbara plans, the only yellow that is designated retail or written down as retail on the plans are these two bits. On the first floor and the second floor, it's coloured blue, like the office space, and it's referred to as Class E. So I don't know what that means, and somebody who's better knowledgeable about planning will explain whether or not that means that they are committed or not necessarily committed to having retail on the other floors. So firstly, having removed all those, you get much better visibility around all this. You get proper frontage around here and here. You would have the loading bay coming through. This ancillary would be whatever this sort of stuff is here. So there's plants and bits and pieces and fire escapes and so on. All of that would occur in here. And you would have a cafe here. And this I've basically stolen Mr. Pilbara's courtyard and put it on there. But I've got a cafe coming around this side and retail here, whereas this has got retail here and an office around there. So I think there's not an unreasonable comparison. I think in terms of public realm, I would suggest that you've got a huge amount more retail all the way around here. Now, if we go to the next slide, please. So what I've done here is I've overlaid the column grid. So this is a combination of a, if you like, a part of my evidence and a new bit of evidence. Now, what I'm suggesting here, because there's some issues around where the pavement and so on goes. What I'm suggesting is that this black line represents where the column line on the original Orchard House is. You could pull that frontage back. You've got about, as I say, about 4.5 meters of height. So you could make that quite an interesting space. And Mr. Pilbara will probably remind me that I said that it's unpleasant underneath the existing overhang, which it is. But that's not to say with imagination and creativity, you couldn't make this much more interesting. And you also give a lot more space for pedestrians to walk around in. And of course, because you've got more yellow here than here, you can afford to do that kind of thing. Next slide, please. So now, this back lump, which I think everybody would agree is a pretty hideous thing. But it is capable of being fixed. Now, this diagram here is from the Arup's report, and it was actually included in Mr. Pilbrow's group of evidence. So Arup identified the limitations on extensions of existing buildings imposed by their structure. Approximately additional 10,000 square meters of floor space could be created within this constraint. Total, therefore, 45,000 square meters GIA. So they found an additional 10,000 square meters. Now, none of these extra floors shown here by Arabs have been included in any of the studies that Mr. Pilbrow did, those 16 studies. None of those include those Arab extra floor levels suggested. And those floor levels are suggested as being entirely achievable. Now, this back bit, I reckon could indeed, because on the Arab drawings, there's no indication of how many extra floors. So this blue bit is my blue bit. But I think you could also get some extra space in this gap here. So this has not been looked at with any, if you like, the dots have not been joined up between what Arabs have assessed and what Pilbrow have been looking at by way of their studies. Now, in terms of creating extra space, so this building here, what you could certainly do is remove sections of brickwork to create windows, which would lighten the load on the foundations, which enables you to put extra load somewhere else. And part of that somewhere else, of course, could be some of this. So by doing that, and bearing in mind that this bit here would be reorganized to be like the Pilbrow scheme in terms of service yard. And this bit here would be cafe and little courtyard on the corner there. All of this would be much more attractive. And you've got, instead of a blank brick facade, you could have fill it up with windows. So it all becomes usable and much more attractive. Next slide, please. Now, this is a new piece of evidence. This is a scheme that we did with my architectural hat on some years ago. And what I'm trying to illustrate here is the business of how to sort out the service yard, because as Mr. Pilbrow and indeed Mr. Gollard said, it wasn't going to work the way I suggested. Now, the reason is because the assumption was that we put a transfer structure at first floor level. And to do that, you drop the level within there, and therefore you wouldn't get lorries in. Now, this building here was a scheme which is that many stories, and there was a tiny bit of extra stuff on top of that. Now, to put 2 extra floors on was not possible in a traditional sense, because this structure was not capable of taking it. So what we did, and the plan of this original building was a C-shaped plan. And what we did is we put a brand new core in, and that core effectively hung those 2 extra floors. This was not strange, complicated engineering. This was all pretty straightforward. But what it meant was we could get 2 extra floors onto a building that could not take extra stuff in a conventional sense. Next slide, please. So what I'm suggesting is that you could certainly, with the service yard, take your structure up to a higher level, maybe even the roof level, and by using your columns to actually hang the structure over the service yard, you could actually make that all work. Now, these 2
plan as well.
Sorry,
Is this a new plan as well?
no, that's from the proof. That's from the rebuttal. I have taken the liberty of putting orange on this plan in order to make a point. So this floor plan, which everybody, and I would agree, is complicated, messy, difficult to understand, all sorts of strange lumps and bumps. Bearing in mind that column grid that I showed you, I believe could be substantially cleared up and cleaned up by taking out all these calls. And this area here, which already has holes in it, because you've got existing lifts and staircase and things and escalators, and here where you've got existing holes for the lifts. You could reorganize those so that you end up by putting the main new core where there are already holes. So you minimize work and you put in new stairs somewhere over here. So what you're trying to do is replicate this kind of an arrangement. Now, obviously, I haven't worked this out in laborious detail, but what I'm saying is that it is not impossible at this point in time to imagine that you can't get something like this to work, which is not unlike this. Next slide. So what I'm going to show you is an example of where we did exactly this, where we moved cores around. Now, this is a new slide, new evidence. So this is a scheme that from Architecture Apple we did some years ago in Farringdon Street in the City of London. And what we did was take an existing building of 9 stories and add 4 extra floors on. Next slide, please. So the way this worked was, here's the existing building, which had concrete cladding and screed, concrete screed, and had a main lift core here with a light well behind it, and these 2 things are staircases. So what we did is we took off all that heavy cladding, concrete cladding. We took off all the screed on the floors. We took out these 2 cores. We kept that core. And then by reducing the weight, by taking all that stuff off, we were able to add 4 new office floors. And we were able to also extend the floor plates out and put in new cores and fill in with extra space. So we were able to completely reimagine that building. Next slide, please. So again, I'm saying that that kind of thing is exactly what I would expect to be able to do here. It's not peculiar. It was entirely economically viable for the then client Tishman Speyer, and it worked and led up and so on. Next slide, please. And on the upper floors, what I'm suggesting is that, and I don't know the extent of this, is that there may well be some additional new space to be put in here above the existing height of this roof level that we walked on the other day. Next slide, please. Now, when we look at the light touch refurbishment, which has been come up, this is the assumptions that Arabs made about the light touch refurbishment. So they assumed that there was no substructure work, fair enough. They say here 0%, no interventions to the superstructure. Facade assumed 10% minimal repairs to fabric. So that's not doing anything special. That it's not an upgrade in environmental terms. It is purely repairs, is what I read here. And then the other point is building services. Assume 10% limited local services replaced. So that's not taking them out or redoing them. It's 10% adjustment. Now this photograph here was taken on our site visit last week. And if you do all this stuff here, all the services, what the light touch refurbished is effectively suggesting is all that stuff will be kept, which is obviously, an unviable. It's no wonder that all the advisors and indeed the planners are against the idea of the refurbishment option that was put forward by the M&S team, because the light touch refurbishment manifestly does not work. And as I've said in my previous evidence and so on, I believe it was a straw man. It was put up to fail. Next slide, please. So if we just compare these, this is obviously the Pilbara scheme. And I think the first thing, apart from comments I've already made, I think digging out 2 levels of basement extra and extending this one, it's not a low carbon activity, it's a high carbon activity. This is a section through the, what I'm calling make the most of the existing buildings scheme, where, as I've said, you refurbish all these, you take all the ceilings and surfaces out, and you would add some extra floors. These 3 floors drawn here are the 3 floors that Arabs said can be done. This floor at the top here is sitting on top of the Orchard Street extension, which again, Arabs have said could be done. These 3 floors, I'm guessing, not guessing, I'm saying it's the sort of thing you would aim for, and certainly on the Orchard Street building, sorry, Orchard House, we know that Arabs have said you can get 2 floors on top of that. So this building, in its what I'm calling a refurbished state, would have a significant additional amount of floor space, which would be new, as I said a bit earlier. Next slide, please. So if we look at this, both Arabs and I have referred to this diagram, which is the GLA decision tree. And I know it was referred to yesterday by Mr. Goddard. So if we take it through, is there an existing building on site? Yes. Is it technically feasible to retain the buildings in Holborn Park? Yes. Is the existing building or parts of the building suited to the requirements for the site? Well, if the requirements for the site to provide office and retail, I think I've demonstrated that there's a pretty good chance of doing that at a viable level. So the answer, which Arab said, which is no, I think is incorrect. I think it is yes, which means you go to this option, retain and retrofit. Next slide, please. So what I've done here, and this is a new piece of information, new slide, new evidence. If you look at this from a carbon perspective, and I know it's been suggested to you that any refurbishment is carbon problematic, but my point is that whatever the carbon cost of the refurbishment, it is nowhere near the carbon cost to knock all those buildings down and rebuild them. So if we just go through some of these bits, so new build, there's 100% demolition. Refurbishment, I'm saying is about 25% based on all the calls coming out and so on. New area, well, we know that figure, that comes from the planning submission. And Mr. Pilbrow suggested that about 12,000, I'm saying let's be a bit more optimistic. Let's say we can get about 15,000 extra space, which would come from those extra floors that Arabs have suggested entirely possible. And I'm suggesting let's be a little bit more optimistic. I reckon we can get a few more with a bit of strengthening locally in the back area. Bear in mind that I'm only talking about strengthening the back brick lump. I'm not talking about strengthening anywhere else. Refurbishment area, well, clearly there's nothing being refurbished in the new build scheme, and there's 35,000 square feet that's going to be refurbished, obviously, in the retrofit scheme. New facade, well, there's 100% new facade in the new build scheme, which is quite a significant part of the carbon cost. And I'm saying there's about 30%. Where does that 30% come from? Well, it comes from the brick lump, but it also comes from the new floors. And I haven't, frankly, analysed this in great detail, but I'm thinking it's that sort of order. Now, energy efficiency. Well, I'm giving the Pilbrow scheme 100% energy efficiency as it's being optimised. But what I'm saying is that this, the refurbishment, could be, I'm calling it 95 plus. Now, how do I work that out? Well, I'm saying the new floors could also be 100%. And with the improvement to things like introducing double glazing, insulation, and so on, you could be at least 95% with the refurbishment of the existing buildings. So these are not that far away, and they're not far enough away to justify knocking the buildings down. So waste. Well, this is going to have 35,000 square meters of waste building. Whereas this one, using the 25%, it's going to have about 9,000 waste, which are all those cores that have been taken out and bits of brickwork around those brick lumps. So whichever way you look at it, there's absolutely no question in my mind that the new build compared to the refurbishment are very different in terms of the overall carbon impact. And therefore, why I put high here and low there is that they will be significantly different. And I think you can't really argue that point. Next slide, please. So, well, I'd just like, before I come to this is my last slide, you'll be pleased to hear. I want to make a couple of key points. One is that a sustainable building, and if we assume that Mr. Pilbrow's scheme is a sustainable building, is not the same as a sustainable site strategy. And indeed, putting his building on an empty site is a very different proposition to putting his building on a site that has usable and viable buildings. I think that there's a great opportunity here to make an exciting, creative and viable scheme of these buildings, and one that I think Marks & Spencer could use as part of their Plan A brand to show how good they are at responding to national policy, in other words, net zero policy, achieving net zero by 2050 and all those other benchmarks. They could demonstrate that they were in tune with all that. And I would also say that the sort of scheme I've shown you, even though people looked at the plans, the sort of level of information I've given you today, sir, is not being provided to any of the other consultants or indeed the local authorities. So it's no wonder that they've rejected refurbishment, because they've been referred to a light touch refurbishment, which I think evidently doesn't work. And I would finally say, I'd also say that the high carbon, to produce a high carbon content scheme, as Mr. Pilbrow is thinking, in comparison to a much lower carbon refurbishment, is, in my view, irresponsible in a climate crisis. And as I said, it doesn't really at all meet the net zero requirements of the government's recent legislation. And I think and I would also say that pretty much everything I've heard is in defending the proposal to knock the buildings down and put a new building in its place. It's really a 20th century answer to a 21st century problem. I'm going to just finish on this. So this is from COP27. We're still nowhere near the scale and pace of emission reductions required to put us on track towards a 1.5 degrees Celsius world. To keep this goal alive, national governments need to strengthen their climate action plans now and implement them in the next 8 years. And that next 8 years covers, of course, any construction that would happen on the site. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you. Mr. Fraser, is that it? Or
That concludes the evidence and sheet, so thank you very much.
Okay. Well, let's take a break now. Mr. Harris, do you need any longer for coffee to take instruction?
No, I don't think so. There is one exercise which it would be helpful, so my team can concentrate on the relevant slides, because of the 37 pages, I made it that more than 20 were new evidence. Could we just flick through? So I'm clear. I might have been misunderstood. If we could just go through them one at a time, very, very quickly, and it'll take 30 seconds. Start at the beginning, please.
Just head up the slides.
Just so that my team know exactly where to focus, sir, because it's clearly a matter of fairness to you and to us. Just new or not new will do. Yeah, the first one, please.
Bear with me.
I'm sorry, I didn't think it was going to take this long.
It's just the technology.
Yes.
But yeah, log back in to the share screen.
The answer to the question, so isn't no idea which I am, but I just, my team might take a different view and I want them to know what's new and what's not. We start at 1.
I
don't
don't
need
think
to debate. I just want to know what's new, in a sense that never seen before.
That's
No, no, just,
existing.
Yep.
That's existing.
Yep.
That's existing. That's existing. That's existing. That's existing. That's new.
that's new, yeah.
Or that's referred to. That's referred to. Again, referred to.
But new,
New.
new,
New.
yeah,
Existing.
yeah, no, no,
Existing.
correct.
New. No, that's existing. That's
existing.
instruction survey.
Oh, no, yeah, it's the next one. That's new, yeah, that's new.
Next.
new.
That's existing
Well, that's not-
information.
That's not new.
It's not
That
new.
was raised with Mr. Pilbrow evidence in chief.
It's existing. That's all existing. Next. Existing. Existing, but I've made a comment about the gaps.
Yeah.
But that's not new. Go back, sorry, next one.
New.
That's, no, that's in my rebuttal.
You said at the time it was no evidence.
So, sorry,
I think the, just
so sorry, I think I might be new,
Yes.
but
You
the,
don't need to, just a feel for which ones my team should look at.
just to clarify on this point, though, that the BCO, the comparison of floor heights to the BCO guide is in your rebuttal.
Yes.
But that specific page
Right.
is not in your appendices to the rebuttal.
Right.
So just to clarify.
There's some new elements, yeah.
next. This is original information. This is my deductions. I don't know if you call that new or existing. Those are site visits, so those are technically new.
Thank you.
That's new.
That's entirely new.
That's new. That's new. New.
New.
This is existing.
Yep.
That's new. It says the photograph's new, but the content is exactly as per the section. Those are new. Again, that's, okay. Those are existing. Existing. That's new.
Yeah.
That's existing, photograph existing. I made some deductions on it, so that's new. That's existing. That's new. That's new.
Oh, that's new. Can you just go back what the inspector was looking down?
Yeah, no, I've got 30.
You got, yeah, great. Cool.
That's existing. Yes, that's existing. Existing, that's a photograph from the site visit. Existing, and this is basically our information put onto that,
But that's new.
but it's a new diagram.
Yeah, it's a new suggestion, way beyond what was put to Mr.
Okay, we don't need to have the numbers.
We don't need to have a debate now, no, but.
25 is.
Yeah, that's fine.
That's an existing, this is new.
36 is new.
All of that information is new. All right,
That's
so
obviously new.
just to identify the scope of the task for us, or the weight which you can give to evidence that can't be cross-examined.
I think it might so be useful if we also counted the extra pages that we had to look at on Mr. Pilbrow's evidence.
Okay, very happy with that. Full.
Well,
Certainly more than.
haven't looked at it.
Mr. Harris, you say can't be cross-examined. I'm prepared to give you additional time if you want to prepare for cross-examination. If you want to have a think about it, you can have an extended coffee.
No. So I'm very happy with the break that we've got.
Right.
I'll need to discuss with the team how we respond.
Yeah, that's what
I don't think it's fair to you to expect me to cross-examine all the evidence that we just heard in its fullness.
Absolutely not, but you need to take instructions on how you deal with it.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, well, what we'll say is that we'll break till 11:30. If you want more time than that, then just let me know.
No, that's fine.
So 11:30 being proposed.
All right.
I get the best of this is